Melee infantry are the backbone of any army. They're literally the first line of defense and are normally relied upon to keep the rest of your army safe. But there are those units that go above and beyond the call of duty and make themselves into some of the best melee infantry in the game. Today, let's count down the top 10 of these units to see who really is the best. But first, this video brought to you by our new channel partner, Holy.
You there?
Me?
Yes, you. Are you a gamer? Do you need great tasting energy and hydration for all that gaming?
I've tried, but energy drink's full of a bunch of bullshit that makes my tummy hurt.
Well, have you tried Holy?
What's that?
Holy is changing the soft drink game with their line of bullshit-free powders. Zero sugar, zero taurine, no artificial flavors or fillers, and only 20 calories per serving. No chemicals, just great tasting drinks and a clear conscience.
That sounds great, but what if caffeine also makes my tummy hurt?
Well then how about Holy Hydration? All the same great flavor, but none of the caffeine. Or maybe you're an iced tea lover, and Holy Iced Tea will be more your dream ticket. All the flavor of fruity, delicious iced teas with none of the sugar. No matter what, just add water, shake, and enjoy.
Wow, you guys have thought of everything, but surely something like this has got to be expensive, right?
That's where you're wrong. At 80 pence per serving, it's a fraction of the cost of traditional energy drinks. And that's not all. Using code Colonel5 at checkout will net you £5 off your first purchase.
Okay, enough. Just tell me where to go already.
Just check out the link in the description and snag yourself a starter set. Sample almost every flavor and get your very own dishwasher-safe, BPA-free shaker cup so you can enjoy in style.
Thanks, Holy.
Yes, me. Thank you, Holy, for partnering with the channel. Listen, I've tried nearly all of these types of drinks, and I can honestly say that Holy is one that I both like the most and feel the best after drinking, so I'm very excited to be partnering up. If you're at all interested in clean, tasty drinks, then check out the link in the description below and grab yourself some Holy. It supports the channel and is also a great product, so it's a win-win, and I'd really appreciate it. Now, back to the video. Kicking off the list, we have Warp Grinders. These are a slightly gimmicky unit, but no doubt a powerful one. Now I hear you, the Warp Grinders have awful melee stats, and in practice, they perform about as well as you'd expect once they get into combat. They lose to most things, and even with that high armor, they will go down fast once they get locked in combat. However, the power of these lads isn't in the raw combat power, it's the abilities. The Warp Grinders come with 2 abilities, making them incredibly useful at the one thing melee troops need to do over all others, keeping enemies still. One slows enemies significantly whilst dealing a little bit of damage, and the other stops all movement completely, locking enemies in place for the rest of their armor to deal all the damage. The only other option to do this sort of thing is with magic, but each of these units can do it just fine and give an army time to take out whatever they stop in place in no time. Now, is it always enough to win the battle with that single exchange? Not really. Is it better than having a normal tanky front line? That's up for debate. But one thing that isn't is that these are one of the most unique units in the game and work excellently at pinning enemies in place and allowing other parts of the army to tear them to pieces where they stand. If you need to halt enemies completely in their tracks, these are the best infantry for the job, at least as long as their abilities last. Also, they're real good at attacking gates and walls, but that's besides the point. You may not need them in every army, but when you need them, they'll be irreplaceable. Next up, we have Sisters of Slaughter, another gimmick unit, but these are actually incredibly effective in the right circumstances. The Sisters' main draw is their deceptive tankiness, which, on first inspection, seems impossible with only 5 armor. But that defense stat, which only gets more insane the more XP they gain, as well as the little bit of physical resistance, makes them hard to get rid of for your average frontlines unit. Once they're locked in melee, they can take an astonishing amount of time to be taken out, since they're just flat out ignoring most damage that comes their way. The damage also isn't too bad with poison and a good punch, even if it's not overly armor piercing. Another benefit of their lack of armor is their speed is extremely high for a melee infantry unit, allowing them to be on enemies in moments, and once they hit, there's no getting away from them. Add on their high leadership and they're one of the hardest front lines to get rid of in the game. However, if the enemy has a lot of range damage or a big spell, yeah, they kind of go down like Marathi on Malekith. All that defense doesn't mean shit when you're in a wall of fire. Can't block that with a whip. But if you can control mages and ranged units, these will put in a great shift and offer a great alternative to slower, heavy armored troops. Coming back to the Skaven, we have another wacky unit, this time the Death Runners. These are still a little bit gimmicky, but are more of a total package than the Warp Grinders. Death Runners are not a frontlines melee troop. They act more like a sneakier alternative to Cav and want to spend battles finding their way onto enemy flanks and charging into undefended ranged units for some easy kills. Their Strider and Stalk combination allows them to move quickly and undetected through practically any terrain, making it a breeze to find exposed flanks whilst leaving your enemies none the wiser. Their high speed allows them to get into those flanks nice and quick, and once there, the melee stats and high damage make short work of whatever they find. The best tags are of course ranged infantry, but with their armor piercing, bonus versus infantry, and armor shredding attacks, they can work great at flanking the front lines to break them in seconds and gain a ton of ground in battle. And once their flank is finished or they start to get in some hot water, they can use their concealment bombs once they're free of melee to essentially disappear and get into a new position to start all over again. They're not the only unit that can adopt this playstyle, but they are perhaps the best at it. Their combination of speed, damage and unpredictability makes them the perfect sneaky flankers and well deserving of a place on this list. Sticking with the sneaky units, we have the Chameleon stalkers, but these are different enough from the Death Runners that they're also making it on the list, and as you might be able to tell, I think they're a little bit better. Now, they're not quite as fast and their melee damage isn't quite as impactful, however, they do have one thing that Death Runners don't: range damage. Their limited ammo explosive missile weapons will allow them to launch a couple of barrages of high base damage explosive projectiles just before they make contact in battle. Bearing in mind these are an early game unit, so will normally be going against low armor, and these missiles can be devastating and cause entire units to break before they even get into melee. Once they do make contact, they'll still deal decent non-armor piercing damage as well as applying poison to anything they touch, giving their targets yet another hindrance to work through. They still share the same sneakiness of Death Runners, but that initial burst of missile damage and poison debuff just edges them over the top to being just a little bit better. Sure, they'll fall off once you get into the mid game, but when you do make use of them, they will easily carry those early battles, no problem. Now we come to the Black Orcs, finally getting something that you'd probably expect to see on this list, and yeah, they're here because they're some of the best front lines in the world. They don't do anything fancy, and honestly, lack shields, so don't do everything that most standard front lines do. However, they're simply some of the best at their basic job that I have no choice but to put them on the list. Just taking a glance at their stats, I'm sure it's obvious why they're here, but let's break it down. Their armor is incredibly high, their HP similarly so, and their defense ain't half bad either. All this adds up to a unit that is incredibly resistant to damage, will absorb a crazy amount of damage, and add on the leadership and they won't go anywhere until they take a lot. For the damage, they have decent attack and extremely high armor piercing damage, making them grind whatever they come up against into a fine mist. Now, they might be slow and the lack of shields makes them a little bit vulnerable to ranged, but none of that matters because their base stats and the ability to work on the front lines is just so damn good. By themselves, they're devastating, but once they're part of a coordinated army with monster backup for damage or some ranged, it's over for whatever you put them up against. They're not quite the best melee infantry unit in the game. In fact, they're not even making it into the top 5 of this list. However, if we're talking just pure line holders doing the basic job of frontlines infantry, they're easily top 3. Going back towards the early game with the armored kossars, and yes, they still are melee infantry, even if they can use a decent amount of ammo from their pistols. These are the early to mid-game Kislev front line, and they're on the list for a number of reasons. I'll talk about them first since I just mentioned them, but those pistols really are something else. The burst damage from these things is impressive, even if it's not overly armor piercing. Remember, this stage of the game they won't be against crazy amounts of armor anyway, so it hardly matters. They're short range, so the most you'll get off is 2, maybe 3 barrages if you're against something really slow, but still, it's burst damage that they wouldn't otherwise have and can get them a great advantage before the lines clash. Speaking of which, their other stats. Armor is nice and high with a silver shield, making them incredibly tough against pretty much all forms of damage. Their melee stats aren't too shabby either, with defense being the real star, making them even tankier. The damage isn't anything crazy and lacks armor piercing like the pistols, but that's really not a problem. Even if enemies are armored, these guys will do their job and hold the line for a very long time, allowing you to bring them support to get the job done. They walk that line between dealing damage and tanking perfectly and are a great choice no matter what you come up against. If they didn't have the guns, they'd be pretty good for the time and price, but with them, they're outstanding in their field. Next up, we have the Bestigors. They're making this list for similar reasons to the Black Orcs. They're just so damn good at their job, and in particular, their job within their specific faction. Stats first, to keep with tradition, they have a little less armor and leadership than the Orcs. In fact, almost everything here is a slight step down, making them a little bit less tanky and deal a little bit less damage overall. So why are they higher on the list? Well, the one stat that is higher is their speed, which is frankly absurdly high for a unit with this much armor. Their speed alone gets them onto this list specifically because it allows them to perform their job within their faction. The Beastmen army is all about speed and momentum and using that to hit enemies as hard and as fast as possible. The Bestigors aren't the fastest units on the roster, but are quicker than almost anything they'll come up against in the late game front lines. This means they can engage faster, allowing your army to move up behind them faster, meaning you can bring in your monsters fast and bolt enemies over faster, and in summary, get the win faster. They're just synergized with the rest of their army so well, and all it takes is that little bit of extra speed. Without it, the entire army would collapse. So yes, they're making the list just for being fast. I mean, they're also a decently kick-ass unit in their own right, but the speed really is the main thing. Breaking into the top 3, we have the humble Dwarf warriors, the backbone of the Dowie early game, and quite honestly, one of the most broken units in the entire campaign if you ask me. Forget infinite ammo rattling gunners, base Dwarf warriors are wacky, and it really comes down to one thing. For a tier 1 unit that the Dwarves can recruit right out the gate, you are getting 85 armor and a shield and 40 melee defense. They are the tankiest thing in the early game, and nothing short of Lords has the power to take them out in those early stages. I mean it, nothing has a real armor piercing at this stage of the game, making Dwarf warriors nigh on unkillable until later into the campaign. Now, will they last you the entire game? Not at all, but in those opening turns, they will be impossible to take down and carry your early games on their strong dwarven backs. This toughness lets the rest of your army do whatever they want, be that firing missiles or probably nothing else since the roster at this point is a bit limited, especially early on. Nevertheless, the warriors are insanely tanky for their stage of the game and are no doubt deserving of a spot on this list. But of course, they're not quite the pinnacle of the dwarven front lines. That honour, of course, goes to the Ironbreakers. Complete opposite end of the spectrum, these are the endgame frontline of the dwarves, and ignoring speed, they really can do it all. They're obscenely tough with armour, health, leadership and defence high enough anything shot of a uranium bomb isn't going to take them down at any decent speed. The damage is... well, the damage kind of sucks in melee, to be honest, but that doesn't matter because their real power lies in their missiles. Just before lines clash, they'll loose their explosive missiles and devastate whatever's coming their way. This damage may not be listed as overly high or armor piercing, but in action it obliterates a good chunk of health off practically anything you aim them at. It's just a couple of barrages tops, but it's often enough to make the following melee into a mercy killing of whatever makes it left, if they even bother. Some units will simply run after being hit, making their jobs as line holders even easier. Now yes, if enemies actually get into melee, their damage isn't the greatest, but that's where the tankiness comes into play. They'll hold the line for hours, giving the legendary dwarven missiles and artillery plenty of time to wipe out whatever they're up against. They've been some of the best frontlines units in the game for as long as they've existed, and they continue to be to this day. But they're not quite the best. With the Infernal ironsworn, the dwarves' chaotic cousins have them beat, and it really is a case of the same unit, but better. They're just as armoured and have more HP. Yes, they have a little bit less defense, but not enough to make a real difference. They trade that for better attack, as well as more weapon strength, extra missile range, as well as trading spell resist for fire, which is probably a little bit less useful, but really doesn't make much of a difference. They simply perform the same job, but they do it better. Once you add it all up, they're just as tanky. They deal tons more damage in melee and can get their shots off early from a range, meaning the chance of using all their ammo before melee is much higher, even if their damage isn't high enough to take down foes. Backup in the forms of missiles, artillery, or monsters can leisurely make their way into battle, whilst the Ironsworn hold the line for the rest of time. Stupidly tanky, stupidly high burst damage, and all coming from one of the most stupidly overpowered factions in the history of the game. What else would you expect for such a reasonable price? Just like the rest of the Chaos Dwarves, the Infernal Ironsworn are ridiculously broken, and no doubt deserve their place at the top of this list. And with that, we've finished my list. Did I miss something that you thought should have been included? Let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want to see more Warhammer 3 top 10s, then why not check out this video here to see the best monster units in the game.